Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Want to shop Walmart Black Friday deals first? Walmart Plus members get early access to our hottest deals. Join now and get 50% off a 1-year annual membership. Shop Black Friday deals first with Walmart Plus. See terms at walmartplus.com.
It is Monday, November 25th, 2024. Hope you're having a wonderful holiday week. Welcome back to Hang Up and Listen, Slate's sports podcast. Back with you again, I am Alex Kirshner. I am a contributing writer for Slate, and I am the co-host of the college football podcast Split Zone Duo. I've got my usual Sage panel this week, and we have lots to chew on. We will discuss the retirement of Rafael Nadal, one of the great athletes in the history, not just of tennis, but I think the world. We will touch base with the National Women's Soccer League after the Orlando Pride won the league on Saturday night over the Washington Spirit, 1-0 in the championship match. And we will assess a moment in time in sports television as one iconic program of the 21st century goes away and another one survives in a different form. Why the differences in their fates? We will talk about it. As usual, joining me this week is Lindsay Gibbs. Lindsay is the author and the founder of Power Plays, a bi-weekly newsletter that adds context to the biggest stories of the day in women's sports. She was the co-host of the feminist sports podcast Burn It All Down. She has written for Business Insider, The Athletic, The Ringer, Bleacher Report, USA Today, and a host of other outlets. And now she is a regular here with us on Hang Up and Listen. Lindsay, how goes?
It goes very well. I am recovering from a trip to Kansas City. I can't wait to tell you all about.
I'm thrilled to get into it. Here you saw a pretty good game of soccer, or kicky ball, as they call it in the United States of America.
Footy.
Also back this week is Ben Lindbergh. Ben is a senior editor for The Ringer. He is the co-host of the Effectively Wild podcast, which I don't say enough on the show. I'm a big fan of. He is the co-author of The MVP Machine, how baseball's new nonconformists are using data to build better players, and the only rule is it has to work. Our wild experiment building a new kind of baseball team. You might know him from his previous work at 538 or Grantland, or as the editor-in-chief of Baseball Prospectus, or from his frequent appearances here on Hang Up and Listen. Ben, hiya.
As Tony Real used to say, 10 topics, 1 winner, horn me. I guess we only do 3 or 4 topics here, not 10. And also we're collaborating, not competing, but otherwise the same.
I wish I had a buzzer right now. Yeah.
Alex can mute us at his discretion.
No, Kevin Bendis, our producer, is going to throw in a little 1, 2, 3.
There's 10 topics, but just 1 winner. Horn time.
Before we get into our business, as always, we want to thank our Slate Plus members for making our show possible. One way that we like to say thank you is with a bonus episode. This week, we will talk about a new league on the block in women's basketball. It's called Unrivaled. Is it a competitor to the WNBA, a supplement, or in the long run, nothing at all, as many startup leagues are in many sports? Lindsay Gibbs will fill us in. You can hear that episode right now as long as you're a Slate Plus member. Subscribe by going to Apple Podcasts and clicking Try Free at the top of our show page, or visit slate.com/hangupplus to get access wherever you listen. Rafa Nadal is done playing competitive tennis. His last match came last week in the Davis Cup, a team event in which he was playing for his home country, Spain, and fell in straight sets. Nadal, 38, had made clear ahead of time that this was going to be it, which gave the entire Davis Cup the feel of a send-off for one of the greats in the sport. I won't call the resume incomparable, because people sure do love to compare it to that of Roger Federer and Novak Djokovic, but the resume is pretty damn extraordinary. I will do a non-exhaustive version of it. 23 wins over number 1 players, all of those being either Federer or Djokovic. 22 Grand Slam titles, often playing as the number 1 player in the world himself. 14 of those titles in the French Open, rendering Nadal the king of clay. He built an 81-match win streak on clay, the longest for any player in his era on any surface. 92 singles titles at the level of the ATP, an Olympic gold medal, And all of that in a career that ends this month, I should say, at 38 years of age. Nadal has been a beloved sportsman and lived a generally scandal-free life during his career. I was looking for controversy to bring up on this show to try to rile up some tensions, and frankly, I had to reach a bit. There was a time he asked for a chair umpire not to officiate his matches because he thought the two didn't get along. But it's pretty tough to find flaws in what Rafa Nadal put together in the world of tennis. Ben, what will define him in your eyes?
Well, each of the members of the big three, tennis's incredible rivals of Nadal and Roger Federer and Djokovic, has long been framed in the context of the other two, which is kind of a cliche. We all know the stereotypes, but in this case, they're kind of true. Federer was elegant and graceful and precise, like the Rolexes he endorsed. Djokovic is a tennis terminator who has no holes, makes no mistakes. And Nadal was brute force with the most muscular game, literally and figuratively. So Federer was famous for not sweating. Nadal was always sweaty, toweling off after every point. Federer was almost injury-free until the tail end of his career. Nadal, even in his prime, had a long list of ailments, missed 16 slams, which makes it all the more impressive that he won 20 of them. Federer had the classic understated fashion, looks like he should have been in a menswear magazine. Nadal early on dressed flashily in tank tops and capri pants and bandanas. So Federer made it look easy and Nadal made it look hard, but they ended up in essentially the same place greatness-wise. And the thing is, you touched on this in your intro, Nadal didn't take his famous intensity off the court. Even on the court, it was focused and concentrated and channeled toward his own performance. He was never one to throw his racket or scream at a line judge. He was humble and philosophical and kind of kept things in perspective. And so, as rare as his talent was, I think that combination of relentlessness and respectfulness might be even rarer, because how many times do we excuse or even expect the times when an athlete's competitive drive boils over in some ugly way, and we just say, well, that comes with the territory. If you want to be great, you have to be broken in some way. And Nadal wasn't that. He was the exception. And after his last match, he said, the way I would like to be remembered is as a good person. And I think he's going to get his wish.
Some of you might not know that I got my start in sports writing through tennis writing. I've been a longtime tennis fan, and it's hard to overstate like how much Nadal has been a part of that journey and that world. Federer's domination of the sport had just started in the kind of mid 2000s. And it looked like he was going to be the one for years and years to come. Nobody could touch him. If you weren't there, it's hard to describe how untouchable Federer was, and unflappable Federer was in 2003, 2004, 2005, until this teenager from Spain came along with, like Ben mentioned, his biceps out and his sweat and kind of stringy long hair, and just pushed Federer to the brink. And that's what I will remember the most, is that kid coming onto the scene and standing up to what at the time seemed like the greatest of all time, and pushing the boundaries of what Roger Federer could be, later pushing the boundaries of course, what Novak Djokovic could be, and all along staying true to his game. I mean, that forehand, his movement on clay, the way he found a way to adapt his style on clay to grass and to hard courts to win multiple slams on all of the other surfaces, and the way he fought through injuries. There were multiple times where it seemed like his career was probably over, and he was able to come back and be better than ever for most of them. And that tenacity, that resilience, it was such a stunning contrast to how simple that Federer made the game look. Federer's style of greatness seemed unachievable. It seemed otherworldly. Nadal was much more workmanlike. And that's an oversimplification, I know, of both of their talents, and probably does disservice to both of them. But I think that for so many years, you were a Federer, you were a Nadal. Like, you picked an identity and you stuck with it. I was erotic, but, that probably explains me the best.
I mean, who in America would not have been erotic, really, if you were alive in the 2000s? When he was really hot culturally, it was hard not to be erotic. I would agree.
Yeah. They all fed off each other, no pun intended, but each one came along and was arguably better than the last. I mean, that's a debate that will be held for the rest of time, but you have Federer with 20 majors, and then Nadal tops him, and then Djokovic tops him. And so each of them kind of came along. Federer's 5 years older than Nadal, and then Djokovic is a little younger even than Nadal and bloomed a little later. And they each sort of set their sights on the other and developed this incredible rivalry. And of course, Nadal has these all-time great showdowns with Federer and Djokovic. The 2008 Wimbledon final versus Federer, the 2012 Australian Open against Djokovic. These are just legendary matches. And Nadal often got the better of those head-to-heads, especially against Fed. The head-to-feds? I don't know. But he really held up his end of the bargain in those matches and often did it hobbled, especially later in his career when he won his last couple majors in 2022 or his last slams. He was injecting, numbing his nerves so he couldn't even feel his foot and was just limping around whenever he was off the court, and people kept counting him out and he kept coming back somehow. And again, like that drive that he had to keep going back out there, even after he had proved everything that he had to prove, so often that seems to come with some sort of twisted, just like nothing matters except that competition, kind of that Michael Jordan-esque chip on your shoulder that has all these costs when it comes to your rivals, your teammates, fans, people in your personal life. And with Nadal, just seemingly, it never did. And he was always kind and courteous to everyone from all accounts. So it was as if he was sort of two people, not really a Jekyll and Hyde exactly, but not that he was a monster on the court either, because he was still pretty respectful, as intense as he was. But somehow he was able to turn that off and more or less be a normal person when he wasn't being one of the most incredible competitors of all time.
To that point, Ben, one thing that I have noticed over the years about Nadal is the extent to which he's a national hero in Spain. And I think that this love affair between an athlete of Nadal's caliber and in Nadal's sport in Spain is really something. It reminds a lot of Seve Ballesteros, who I think is the most beloved golfer in his country of anyone who has ever played the sport of golf. I think that there's a certain pride that a lot of Spaniards feel for having these national heroes in these kind of country clubby sports where other European countries are known historically for having a bigger concentration of the game's greats. And yet here's this best of all time, or certainly top 3 of all time player who comes from Spain, who deals with people the way that you just described. Am I onto something about the sort of national iconic status that Rafa Nadal seems to enjoy in Spain? And I don't want to say the singularity of it, but certainly the specialness of it.
I think so, and I think that's why he went out the way he did in the Davis Cup, as opposed to the scenes of his greatest triumph. Of course, he had some Davis Cup triumphs too, because where didn't he triumph at some point during his career? But you might have expected him to go out in the French, but he wanted to go out in Spain, and he had a pretty low-key exit. Now, granted, people expected maybe he would get a little deeper, and I think the only matches he lost in Davis Cup competition were his first and his last. So if he had made it a little deeper into the tournament, then some of the luminaries that he had competed against were planning to be in attendance. As it was, they had a video that they sent to him, but he didn't really want a big hullabaloo. He kind of wanted a low profile exit stage right, bow out gracefully. And obviously he wasn't nearly the player that he'd been in his prime. And if you've been watching him for decades since he was a teen phenom, it does make you feel a little old watching him, clearly diminished as a player, but also older looking, right? A little less hirsute than he once was. The biceps not quite as bulging as they once were. So there's the passage of time, and mortality is undefeated, as we learned when we watched Tyson versus Paul, and he is no exception. But he maintained his reputation and sort of his grace about the game, and still was, shouting and fist pumping and vamosing right up until the end.
I do think, not to throw cold water on the adoration, but he should not have been picked to play singles in Davis Cup. He was in no way the best pick for that match. And it was a really weird thing. Like, his entire retirement tour this year has been awkward. And I think there's been a lot of defiance in it. He's, even at the French Open, he was like, I'm not going to say this is really my last, when it was so clear that his body, could not perform anymore. And he had said last year that he was going to do one more year this year, and he stuck that out. He kept coming back and kept trying, and you can never, that too reminds me of his tennis, that every time you thought that he was out of a match, he would find a way to dig back in. He's really, really stubborn in that way. And I think you could see some of the stubbornness in his retirement tour. It left a little bit of a bad taste in my mouth. Like, it will be over very, very quickly because of how great his career was. But I just think it was just kind of an awkward situation. If you all don't know, Davis Cup is the team competition, and you kind of pick the best two players in your country, presumably, to play singles and then one doubles team. And Nadal has in no way kind of earned that spot this year. And so much of his career has been about earning. So it was just, and he lost the match. So, and eventually, Team Spain lost the tie to the Netherlands. And so that was just kind of an awkward way to go about it. But as we've said over and over again, finding the right way to say goodbye, there isn't one. And so Nadal's loyalty to the Davis Cup, to the team competition, it's a huge part of his legacy. He won it 5 times over a 15-year span, from 2004, when he came on the scene and took down Andy Roddick when it was Spain versus USA in the final, all the way to 2019 when they won. So he is Spain. Like, it's part of his heart and soul.
Lindsay, one thing I want to ask you about, just to sort of confirm a suspicion that I have, not a suspicion, but a feeling. I get the sense that tennis people don't so much mind talking about Djokovic and Federer and Nadal in one big conversation and in relation to each other, in the way that some basketball fans might find it toxic if you do LeBron and Jordan, for instance, or in a way that baseball fans might think it's toxic, Ben, if you try to compare Shohei Ohtani to the best players of the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, just because things are so different. But it seems, Lindsay, like there is absolute consensus among the tennis community that we've just lived through a really special time where the 3 best men's tennis players ever, period, no question whatsoever, were living at the same time and going at each other at the same time. And so there's sort of almost a how lucky were we, and it's fine to talk about them in relation to each other so much feeling. It doesn't feel as exhausting as trying to compare Kobe and LeBron or LeBron and Jordan. Am I right about that?
I see you have not been on tennis Twitter much, Alex.
No, not enough.
No, I think that the fan bases can get as toxic in tennis as they can in any sport. However, I think because tennis is 1v1, right? At the end of the day, you cannot tell the stories of these players without talking about them together. We never knew Nadal without Federer and eventually Djokovic. Like, they measured in real time against one another. And that's what's so special. So I don't think there's a reluctance to have the conversation. I think it's a must. And I do think that everyone, whether you're a Federer or Nadal or Djokovic fan, everyone realizes how special this was. I mean, when Pete Sampras retired with 14 slams, that seemed like an impossible number to reach. And then we have 3 guys in one generation just soar past it. But I don't want to paint the tennis fandom as some evolved place. It can get ugly.
And I think part of that is that these legends overlapped. So
Right.
you're not having to do some era adjustment as you have to do even with Jordan and LeBron, who didn't overlap. Jordan exited, LeBron entered, the torch was passed, but they didn't go head to head, whereas these guys many times did. And so that whole discussion of back in the day, how much worse were players, or some people will argue better, which is always a tough sell to me, you don't have to make that adjustment because these guys were contemporaries. And because they had so much respect for each other. I think Federer and Nadal is such a great rivalry because those guys, they had contrasting styles and because they clearly had such a depth of affection for each other. Of course, Nadal was there at the end of Federer's career, and there's that famous photo of them, tears and touching fingers, and it's framed in Federer's house. Like, these guys mean a lot to each other. And so I think that helps a little with the discussion. And, there are different dimensions to it where you could talk about their respective strengths. And there was a time early on when you might have dismissed Nadal and said, well, he's just a clay court specialist. And of course, he's the greatest of all time on clay, and his record is unbelievable. But he ended up winning 8 majors off clay, which is more than many legendary players won on all surfaces combined. So even though there's a literal statue of him at Roland Garros, you can't say that he was just a one-dimensional player. And he's, in the top 10 for 18 years, the longest streak in the history of men's tennis. So I think it's a fun, really unresolvable debate. And I guess the question facing tennis is what's next? You have Carlos Alcaraz, Nadal's Davis Cup teammate, fellow Spaniard, who's kind of the next generation, well on his way to putting himself in the same breath and sentence as those 3. But Djokovic is the last man standing now, and he may well have just one more year to go. And in fact, in a sign of the times, Andy Murray is coaching him now, just his old rival, trying to eke out whatever is left in his 37-year-old frame. So we're one away from this era, which was just so long lasting. That was the thing. We had plenty of time to appreciate it because it was so historic that they were also productive into their sports old age. And so it's almost surreal that, we are actually almost at the end now.
Yeah, and in that note, Alcaraz obviously was by Nadal's side in this Davis Cup tie, and Yannick Sinner's team, Italy, won the Davis Cup, we should mention, over Netherlands in the final of that event that started with Nadal's retirement. And so, Sinner's year has been one of the best we've ever seen as well. I mean, he won both Australian Open and the US Open, the Davis Cup, won the year in championships, a solid year in number 1. So there is a future, but it's never going to be exactly the same. Can I end with a trivia question?
Oh, of course.
Sure.
14 Roland Garroses, but who did Nadal beat in the final of his first Roland Garros when he was 19 years old in 2005?
I'm just gonna take a wild guess here. Andre Agassi.
Nope. Ben, you got any guesses?
Was it? I guess it probably wasn't Federer. It was, but he probably played Federer in that tournament, I'd imagine, maybe in the semis. But no, I do not remember the final matchup.
Mariana Puerta, Argentine. And that was what clay court tennis was before Nadal came along. It was a bunch of kind of random clay court specialists. No offense to Mariana Puerta, who reached a career high number 9 in the singles rankings. But clay court tennis, Nadal put it on the map. And, Mariana Puerta is now trivia answer.
I wonder if we're better podcasters on grass, clay, or hard court. Might have to test it. Set up the microphone on different surfaces.
Like the Battle of the Surfaces, the famous one between Nadal and Federer, where Federer was on grass and Nadal was on clay.
Probably none of us touches grass that much.
No, there's no chance that we do.
Okay, troll.
Up next, the National Women's Soccer League season ends in style. Lindsay was there. How did it go? Where does it leave the league? On the verge of a whole new labor regime. We'll talk about it. This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Because Progressive offers discounts for paying in full, owning a home, and more. Plus, you can count on their great customer service to help you when you need it, so your dollar goes a long way. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save on car insurance. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations. This holiday season, don't forget your number one fan, you. So what's a gift you could use? Maybe go to more home games, or even travel to some away games while rocking a new away team jersey. Well, here's something for you. Discover automatically doubles all the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cashback Match. With Discover, you could turn $150 cash back into $300. That'll help with the swanky away jersey. It pays to Discover. See terms at discover.com/credit card. Back here on Hang Up with Ben Lindbergh and Lindsay Gibbs, I am Alex Kirshner. The 12th season of the National Women's Soccer League wrapped up this weekend. The Orlando Pride, a perennial non-playoff team that made a big step forward this year, claimed the NWSL Shield in the regular season, and then won 3 straight in the playoffs, the last of them in Kansas City, 1-0 over the Washington Spirit. Lindsay, was it a fun 1-0?
And the answer is yes, of course. Both defenses were spectacular. It was a very physical game. There were lots of nervy off-target shots. But listen, any game that is played in a sold-out, state-of-the-art stadium that was built specifically for a women's team, the Kansas City Current, that had a classic Barbara Banda goal, that is a tight game throughout. Obviously, a 1-0 scoreline. It was in doubt till the very end. The Spirit are known for late equalizers, so it felt like that equalizer could come at any minute. And a game that ends with Marta, the greatest of all time, lifting a trophy, cussing live on CBS primetime, and hugging her mother, who was in America to watch her play for the first time ever. I mean, that's a good game. Ugliness aside.
Since you were on the scene, I wanted to ask, you mentioned CPKC Stadium, this privately financed venue, as you said, billed as the first stadium built specifically for a women's professional sports team. I know they sold out KC Current games all year, and they sold out this match. How was the atmosphere at a neutral site championship?
It was very, very good. There were some empty seats, I have to say. I don't think it set an attendance record, even though it did sell out. The Current lost in the semifinals to the Pride, and it was a very cold night. So I am sure that there were some resale tickets that unfortunately did not get sold, but it still felt very, very full. I just, felt like I would be lying if I didn't mention that there were some in the upper bowl empty seats. But the atmosphere was incredible. I mean, you have legends of the game playing. The fans traveled really well, which I think is a testament to the growth of the league, because there was only 1 week in between the semifinals and this championship game. It wasn't a 2 weeks like it's been in previous years or like we have for the Super Bowl, which makes it harder for fans of the teams that make it to the final to get there. But you had the Washington Spirit basically had their entire Spirit squadron there. They filled up an entire supporter section. Pride fans were also very loud and very vocal. And of course, there was a lot of teal for the Kansas City Current, but those fans were all really appreciative of the good game too. The atmosphere was remarkable.
It's a thing as women's sports continue to grow in this country that you're going to run into some of the same logistical and fan attendance problems that every sport except the NFL, because the NFL is in its own class of alien activity that is not earthbound in any way, but that all of these other leagues deal with. Every other sports league in the world, from high-level college football to major North American professional sports that have decades of market advantage, are having a hard time getting people into their seats because it's gotten really easy to watch these things on television. Lindsay, this was a huge year for the NWSL. We've talked on this show about the recently updated, recently agreed collective bargaining agreement that's going to do all kinds of things. It's going to eliminate a draft in an effort to attract more of the world's best players. Salaries are going to go up. There are more. You mentioned that the game was on network television on CBS. There's going to be more of that in the future. New broadcast deals. Bob Iger and Willow Bay bought into a team in LA at a $250 million valuation. So as a sports business story, like, obviously things are pretty good. We've talked about that. I'm wondering, as a longtime follower of this league, as a fan of the sport, like, how do you feel this is all going in terms of the product on the field getting better, the game day experience getting better for the people who, were here first and who are enjoying this sport as it sort of undergoes this sports business boom that we've talked about before?
Yeah, I mean, you obviously lose the intimacy, but supporters groups used to be small enough to essentially travel on commercial planes with the players for away games. And, nobody wants to go back to those days, but there is an affinity for remembering, what that was like. And I talked to a lot of longtime players about the years not that long ago, 5-6 years ago, when players lived with host families still. And it was funny because you talk down about that time. Like, there were a lot of bad experiences, but then there were a lot of players that were like, I just officiated a wedding for my host family as kids. There's just a lot of kind of sweetness too in that time. But this is special too. And I got to say, the pro of having a predetermined site is that it gives time for the brands and the league and everyone to organize a full weekend experience around the championship game and make the championship itself a destination, whether your team is in it or not. And we really, really saw that. I mean, from the Fan Fest to there were all these live podcast recordings, panels, events. There was so much programming around the game itself that it was just a really full, great fan experience. And I think that's not possible if you have the host, the top seed host. You can't get all that together in a few days. So I think in that sense, like, all this growth is literally in front of you. You see it in the branding. I mean, Ally is the sponsor who has made this move to primetime possible. They've paid for it. I had a lot of good conversations with Ally executives over the weekend about their push to keep growing this league and to keep putting the pressure on broadcasters to put women's sports in better spots. And you really have a lot of people on board who see it as a great business investment and who see it as a great cause. And I like the two are at odds. Of course, there's tension there, but there can also be real beauty when it all synergizes.
And there can be dollars.
Yeah.
Talking NWSL is making me nostalgic for our first pod together all of 3 months ago when we discussed the new NWSL CBA. Hopefully we have come a ways since then, though not as far as the league has come in recent years. And yes, that is kind of a commonality. Whenever I read a story about the explosive growth of insert women's sports competition here, it's just in such recent memory how travel used to be substandard and how there didn't used to be dedicated executives marketing the game, and there just used to be so little infrastructure. And this is not ancient history. This is when people who are playing now were
2021.
playing. Yeah, right. This is very recently. And I know that the total gate has grown every season of the NWSL's existence, except when it came back in the pandemic in 2021 after the 2020 season was canceled. And a lot of that is adding teams and games, and there's more expansion on the horizon. Caitlin Clark, of course, connected to the NWSL as well as part of the bid for a Cincinnati expansion team. But it's not just total attendance, it's also per game attendance. And so I wonder, I feel like I'm going to be redirecting to Lindsay a lot in this segment, but I wonder how you would place the success of the league this year and its kind of breakthrough into the broader sports consciousness on the spectrum with the Women's March Madness tournament or the WNBA. And because the NWSL has been established as the best women's soccer league in the world, is the ambition then not just to be the best women's soccer league, but also to compete, to go head to head with the biggest leagues of all kinds? I mean, are there more mainstream plans here, and how soon could they be accomplished?
Wow, those are light questions, Ben. No, I was at listening to a live podcast by Men in Blazers and the Women's Game host Sam Mewis, and she was interviewing the great Lauren Holiday, U.S. Women's National Team superstar and wife of Boston Celtics, Drew Holiday. And, you know, she was mentioning that she believes that within 10 years, we'll have $1 billion valuation for an NWSL team. And that sounds mind-boggling, but just 4 or 5 years ago, these teams were at about $2 or $3 million. And now you have the biggest one valued at $250 million. That type of growth is inconceivable. And yet it is the reality in professional women's sports, especially in the WNBA and NWSL right now. And the NWSL is a lot more attractive in a lot of ways to owners because you don't have to deal with the NBA, right? Like if you buy into ownership of an NWSL team, you own the full thing. Whereas, you know, the NBA still owns like 42% of the WNBA. So it's a little convoluted there. So you're just seeing more and more investment, and there is ambition to compete with the big leagues. There is ambition to keep pushing. And I think you're seeing ratings for men's sports come down to earth a little bit, and you're seeing ratings for women's sports rise. And there's going to be some sort of equilibrium here. But I think it's, you know, I want to go back to something that Alex asked me that I never addressed directly, but it's really important. The product on the field is just getting better and better and better as we go. The Orlando Pride is a very international team. Marta brought on tons of Brazilians. We got Barbara Banda, who they figured out, you know, how to get a lot of money to her because there's flexibility within the cap in the NWSL. And you're seeing the NWSL being able to not only claim it's, you know, the best league in the world from top to bottom, but that it can attract the biggest stars in the game, even if they're not Americans.
I want to ask about that specifically. Lindsay, it does seem like the league is really deep, but in terms of like the absolute top flight players, at least as they seem to be sort of consensus ranked when you go and look around player rankings and you dive through soccer message boards for who are the absolute best players in the game right now. This is evolving in soccer because class is permanent, but form is temporary. That of the top 10 or 15 best players in the world, they are basically all in Spain, Germany, or England. And you've got some big ones in America. You've got Sophia Smith playing for the Thorns in Portland, but she's an outlier, not the rule. Obviously the NWSL is trying to get more of those top players. We've talked about that being maybe the impetus for the new collective bargaining agreement, and why the owners of the teams would want to go with it is to get more top flight talent to the league. Do you see a measurable goal or like a reasonable target that you want to have X of the best players in the world coming to this league during the primes of their careers, or do you measure a talent influx differently as you look forward?
Yeah, the real challenge is going to be getting the Europeans, right? Because the game is still, unfortunately, very European-centric, and there are top clubs that have partnerships with men's clubs that are able to pay the top stars in the game really well, and don't have the same salary cap kind of restrictions that we do here in the United States. And they want to stay closer to home, right? They want to stay in Europe because it's a long season. The NWSL season lasts from February all the way through almost December. And of course, there are international breaks. And so if you're a European, you are constantly having to go back, to Europe for your national team throughout the year. It's a lot of travel. So it's going to take a lot more than, money is the place to start for sure. But I think that until it's fully charter flights and, they kind of get some of the scheduling quirks down, because the schedule is easier and less travel when you are in Europe as well. I mean, a lot of these players from other countries are just shocked at, there are a lot of West Coast teams now, and the Orlando Pride were talking about how rigorous the travel schedule was, because they have to go to the West Coast, and that's a longer flight than you have to go to a lot of other countries when you're playing in Europe and playing in other leagues. So that is working against it. But what I think the NWSL has working for it is a really strong players union that is pushing for more and more protections, and also it's starting to get security and longevity. Marta was talking about how she had been with the Orlando Pride for 8 years, and she had stuck with that team for 8 years in order to get her title. And I was thinking about how rare that is, that anyone in women's pro sports gets to be with a team for that long, simply because they don't get to exist for that long, right? They're given 2 or 3 seasons, and then everything is scrapped when it's not making enough money. So we'll see. But getting players from Africa, getting players from Brazil, both Banda and Marta were talking about, just being the destination league for those players can go a long way, because there is a lot of talent in South America, and of course in the entire continent of Africa. Banda was talking about getting more African players to the league.
Yes, Banda is Zambian.
Yes.
Yeah, and the broader ambitions that we were talking about, the increased revenue and attention, the league used to be broadcast on Lifetime, and that was a plus. That was better than the previous situation, just to be on TV reliably at all. But that was marketing to a certain audience and catering toward a female audience. Not that it's not now, but I think the ambitions are broader than that, that this is on where people are watching, wherever they are, what channel, whatever streaming service they use. You can find the NWSL, and that should only help with attracting more players, with paying those players, with improving the conditions. And I was struck, the story of Marta and how long she has been in Orlando. It's just kind of a contrast to what we were talking about a couple of weeks ago, Alex, with Messi in Miami and the track record of big international stars coming to MLS, sometimes at the tail end of their careers, past their prime, sometimes not. But Marta said that this game was the most important of her career. And this is a 6-time World Player of the Year. She's played in World Cup final, 3 Olympic gold medal matches. But this one, she said, was the most important of her career. And I don't know that you would hear Messi saying that about an Inter-Miami match. You almost certainly wouldn't, because he doesn't talk to the press about playing for Inter-Miami. But even if he did...
And you would know he was lying if he said that. And we all remember the World Cup final against France. You would know he was lying.
Right. And yet it's plausible here because Marta has put in 7 losing seasons, and because this is such a high-level league, it's just not quite comparable to MLS in multiple ways. And I guess that works to the NWSL's advantage.
Absolutely. I mean, can I just gush about Marta for a minute?
Sure.
Just seeing her lift this trophy, the way she was with the press. I mean, earlier in her career, she would be so uncomfortable speaking English, which I totally understand, but she would pretend not to speak English. She just wasn't comfortable almost in her own skin. She's openly posting with her fiance who's on the team and just being out and proud. And these are all things that, you know, are a new side of Marta that the American audience for sure hasn't gotten to see, and that she hasn't really been comfortable sharing with the world at a lot of points in her career. And so there's a lot of beauty in getting to see the greatest player of all time, who, it should be mentioned, had the greatest NWSL season of her career at age 38 this year. This is no like Nadal fading off into the sunset.
Yeah.
This was no you know, she was not just a figurehead. Like, she was an integral part of this team. She was named to the best 11 for the NWSL this season. Like, she was dominant. And to see her get this center stage moment and be able to share herself and her story and to share it with her mother, who, like I mentioned in the opening, Marta's played in the Orlando Pride for 8 years, and she was in previous women's soccer leagues in America that were earlier. She was in the WPS, and her mother had never been able to come to watch her play a game in America until this Saturday night.
Pretty cool. And it goes to something that is important about trying to make sports and make sports leagues, make sports championships matter. They get their meaning because the people who play them care about them. You know, like the Super Bowl would have been a flop if after the AFL and NFL merger, when they start calling the championship game the Super Bowl, if all the players had said, this is a hokey corporate thing. It's an exhibition. We don't really care. It would have been a flop. If the World Series would be a flop if AL and NL players said, the real championship is winning our league with the teams that we play against all year, and we think this interleague play stuff is ridiculous. Like, it matters because the players think that it matters, and we take cues from them. And it's clear that in the NWSL, it matters.
Yeah. And we should mention, I know we mentioned earlier, I think we mentioned earlier, but that the Pride won the Shield as well. So they had the best regular season and won the championship. That doesn't happen often in the NWSL. And, you know, the NWSL is trying to put more import on the Shield, similar to the way other soccer leagues do. But there's nothing like winning the championship game. That's an American thing, but we love it.
And there are a lot of rags to riches stories in the NWSL, right? Teams that were bad very quickly becoming good. Lots of exciting final finishes with upsets and action overturning leads. So there's a sense that there's enough parity that conceivably anyone can contend in the not too distant future. So that's another reason to get on board.
Every team has talent. You just need the investment. And there's a lot of opportunity there. But can I mention the biggest part about this weekend that we haven't mentioned yet?
Did you have good barbecue in Kansas City?
No, but I made Art But Make It Sports on
wow, congrats. Big time.
You know, I had to still kind of humble myself to come on our podcast today, but you know, it was a dream come true. Marta made her dreams come true, and my photo of Marta celebrating her dreams came true made my dream come true. So
yeah, the reflected glory. I appreciate it. Thanks for slumming it with us.
Up next, we will talk about the end of Around the Horn, an institution of sports television in the 21st century, and the lack of an ending for Inside the NBA, whose future had appeared in grave doubt given the NBA's broadcast rights situation. We'll be back. After a night with drinks, it's tough to bounce back the next day. But with Z-Biotics, there's a surefire way to wake up feeling fresh after a night of drinking. Z-Biotics pre-alcohol probiotic drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It is this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. Pre-alcohol produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make Z-Biotics your first drink of the night, drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. Also, ZBiotics is continuing to invent probiotics that will help with everyday challenges of modern living. Go to zbiotics.com/hangup to learn more and get 15% off your first order when you use hangup at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with 100% money-back guarantee, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/hangup and use the code hangup at checkout for 15% off.
Whole Foods Market has Thanksgiving gatherings covered. First things first, reserve your no antibiotics ever fresh whole turkey today, starting at $2.99 a pound. Or go with their organic spiral cut bone-in ham, full of seared-in flavor. For sides, choose Whole Foods Market grab-and-go platters. Go even further and get your whole meal catered. Just order online by November 26th. Get Thanksgiving ready at Whole Foods Market. Terms apply.
With my friends Lindsay Gibbs and Ben Lindbergh, I'm Alex Kirshner, still with you here on Hang Up and Listen. Two really big pieces of sports TV news in the past week. First one, it's good news. Inside the NBA survives. The TNT halftime show's future was in flux beyond this year because TNT's parent, Warner Brothers Discovery, lost its rights to air NBA games, which landed with ESPN, Comcast, and Amazon in different parts. What would happen after that, people wondered, to the iconic halftime show with Charles Barkley and Shaquille O'Neal and Ernie Johnson and Kenny the Jet Smith? We now know that TNT will keep producing the show and ESPN will pay for the privilege to use it on its broadcasts of NBA games. This seems like a nice outcome for everybody, as Inside the NBA really has become a whole thing unto itself with NBA television audiences. It's great that it's not going away. The second piece of news, though, is sadder, that Around the Horn is ending. The sports debate show, which debuted in 2002 and has owned the 5 p.m. Eastern time slot on ESPN for more than 2 decades, will soon go away. It has aired right before Pardon the Interruption with Michael Wilbon and Tony Kornheiser. You have surely seen it, whether you've sat down to watch it or you've seen it at a sports bar or in an airport. It is one of the most omnipresent shows in sports for a very, very long time. ESPN has not commented on why this is happening, why it's going away, but this is a ratings game. We all know it. Ratings are not quite what they once were. Perhaps this is in a streaming era, just not a moment where appointment daytime sports talk TV at a certain time draws the numbers that it once did. Okay. Not really clear what ESPN's alternative plan is, but that is Disney's right to obviously put whatever it wants in the 5 p.m. Eastern time slot. Ben, why do you think that something like Around the Horn could not be longer for this world, given, decades of people seeming to really enjoy it and it being a launching pad for, frankly, many of our friends in the sports media industry?
Yeah, it's interesting. The ratings are down, but it's still drawing a few 100,000 people on average. It wasn't like Skip Bayless's Undisputed on FS1 at the end of its run, where it was just sort of a ratings ghost town, crickets. So maybe they could have kept it going a while. It does sound like they don't have a ready replacement in mind, though they're working on it. Eric Reindholm, the mind behind PTI and Around the Horn, is said to be brainstorming potential successors. It's been around for so long. I always have to remind myself that when it started, of course, Max Kellerman was the host. It's kind of like a Craig Kilborn, the original host of The Daily Show situation. And Tony Reali was stat boy on PTI. And it's almost a wonder that it ever worked as well as it did, because it's so frenetic. There are so many topics, so little time, so many panelists. It's hard to have any sort of in-depth discussion. Here at Hang Up, we cover 3 or 4 things in an hour, and sometimes we feel like we didn't have time to say everything we want to say. How about if you have 15 seconds in your little box in the corner of the screen, and if you don't say something clever, then you will get muted and you won't get any points, right? But I think it does have to do with the era. Everything has changed in sports media, in broadcasting, on the internet since 2002. And yes, it is hard to have appointment viewing for an afternoon cable show, even if there is that hold of people who've been watching for decades at this point. And there's no shortage of access to sports opinions, right? Sports takes are ubiquitous. And so given social media, you can see a zillion unlimited takes anytime you want. You don't necessarily have to tune in to Around the Horn to get them. And maybe that is why ESPN has kind of pivoted to stars, right? And has tried to see how many hours can we squeeze out of Stephen A. Smith? And what can we have Joe Buck and Troy Aikman do? And can we have Pat McAfee on TV all day? And also, can we get Charles Barkley, which we're about to talk about? Or can we hire Jason Kelsey to host a late night show? So a lot of it is actually star driven, which is sort of a shame because Around the Horn helped create stars and prominent people who became pillars of ESPN programming and elsewhere. And maybe you're losing that pathway. But I think you're pivoting to more podcast style shows now. Less production, fewer guests, almost sort of simulcasting. Because people come to it for the relationships, for the rapport, to have the same few people on the show every week. And Around the Horn doesn't really have that, for better or worse, and probably has that even less than it used to. So you tune in one day, it's going to be a different mix of people than were there the day before. And it's harder, I guess, to be appointment viewing and retain an identity that way.
Which Inside the NBA has, because
Yes.
Inside the NBA airs at halftime and before and after NBA games. And so you can only get it at a certain time. It's part of your experience sitting down and watching a game. And in that way, it's kind of like prestige television that everyone gathers around and watches at an appointed time. You wouldn't stream it. Well, maybe some people would. Actually, I don't know what people get up to on their Max accounts, but you do, Lindsay, go at a certain moment and watch that thing as part of an experience that you are definitely having live. And that's the only thing that can replicate that is live sports.
Yeah, and, like Ben mentioned, whereas on Around the Horn, it's a variety of different faces and personalities every day, except for Tony Reali, who I love and we'll talk more about in a minute. But, on Inside the NBA, you are, for the most part, I know they have their B team, but for the most part, you're coming back to the same people, and there's comfort in that, and there's excitement in that. And I am really thrilled that the show is going to continue. I hope ESPN doesn't mess with it. I'm a little curious. It just seems like its pacing is so different from the way ESPN does its production. I also hope this doesn't result in more layoffs at ESPN. I don't know. I'm just always worried about layoffs. But I do think that this is a good outcome for Inside the NBA. And for Around the Horn, I gotta say, I'm really sad. It's been a huge part of my life. I used to always watch that Around the Horn, PTI, back-to-back happy hour. I remember whenever the Panthers were good, I was in high school, I would sit there and wait and see if they had a Panthers topic and, be really excited to hear what they had to say. And it's also important that this could be taken the wrong way, but I'm a journalist. I like to see opportunities for other journalists, and it seems like a lot of the sports media opportunities are going to former players who I want to have opportunities as well. But Around the Horn, I think the reason why so many sports journalists are a little sad about it is because it was a venue for columnists and journalists, and it did help build careers. And Tony Reali really focused on getting diverse voices. I mean, I saw more women on Around the Horn when I was a young sports fan than I did on any other show. And that just continued as I ended up going into sports journalism. And as my career has continued, so many of my friends have been on it and gotten a platform. A lot of them have brought women's sports to the conversation. I'm not going to say that they did covered women's sports predominantly, but they were always open to bring it up as a topic of conversation. And it just was an in for different viewpoints and different people. And there aren't many ends anymore. So it just kind of feels sad that that's leaving.
Yeah, and when that show started and you had Woody Page and Jay Mariotti and these other people, it was very newspaper-centric. You had
It was
people,
all-star columnist, yeah.
Right, all-star columnists, and there's almost no such thing anymore. The sports columnist, that local authority, doesn't quite matter as much anymore, doesn't have the same sort of pulpit. You even had guests kind of doing live remotes from newspaper offices where you would see people walking around in the background through the glass, and now those offices probably aren't open anymore, or they're a lot less crowded than they used to be. So I think that's part of it. And also, I don't know, maybe just the idea of the generalist, maybe there's more value placed on expertise. If you want to listen to someone talk about a particular sport, there's 8 zillion podcasts where you can listen to people who specialize in that sport, as opposed to someone who is trying to be a jack of all trades. Now, obviously, I hope that Hang Up and Listen continues forever, as we all try to be generalists, but of course we three are experts on everything, but we're the exception, otherwise
Exactly.
It's hard to have that sort of range out there in the media world. And so maybe people aren't quite craving that as much anymore. It also stands out to me that when Around the Horn started, it was seen as sort of a sign of the sports apocalypse. It was kind of part of the embrace debate trend, which hadn't really been dubbed that at that point, but Stephen A. and Around the Horn and PTI and the sports shouting and everyone having takes and talking heads, and people thought, oh, this will be the death of sports. And I don't know, maybe to some extent it was, but I think Around the Horn mellowed over the years, and Stephen A. has been, I think, embraced as an icon just because he's a generational talent. He is singularly skilled at what he does. People are proposing him as a president in the future. That's the level of affection for Stephen A. these days. So I don't know if it's just that the shouting got less heated, or that even the sports shouting is a higher caliber of discussion than you're going to see on social media, or what, but inside the NBA is the same sort of thing. It's a hangout. It's a vibe. And those players, ex-players, they're truth tellers. They're honest. They're unvarnished. That is a big part of the appeal of that show. But also, it's not so much about the acrimony. It's about, hey, these guys get along.
Yeah, people watch so that they can see people who appear to be friends kind of getting together. Whereas, of course, on this show, we're like the band who goes into the studio and then doesn't talk to each other the rest of the week. Our managers communicate for us.
If you would respond to my text, Alex, but I do want to say that Tony Reale is just a really special person, and I understand that my view of the show is a little bit clouded because in 2019 I wrote a profile on Muffet McGraw, and when I was working for a site called Think Progress, and she said that she would never hire a male coach again, and it made a lot of shockwaves. There was response columns to it. They did an entire segment on it, but they only mentioned the columns that were in response to my long reported piece that I'd gone to South Bend to report. They mentioned stuff from my piece in their conversation, so it was very clear they had read it. And I was a little sad. I was working for an outlet that was up for sale at the time. We were trying to get, views. I'd worked really hard. My work was being cited on this national program, but it wasn't, And so I sent Sarah Spain, who was one of the panelists. I was kind of shaking, but I sent her this DM, just kind of telling her how I was feeling, not accusatory. And the next day, Tony Reale did an entire shout out segment to me, put my article on the big screen and apologized and did a mea culpa. And it was really nice. And I'll just never forget that. And he's since quoted my newsletter, my little newsletter, Power Plays. He's used that as intros for segments. And that's meant a lot in this industry. So I just wanted to say that.
Have you been cited by Charles and Shaq?
No.
I guess
but I bet they have some opinions on Muffet McGraw that I do not want to hear.
They might not cite their sources.
Your move, TNT.
Yeah.
Everyone's shouting out power plays except for apparently you.
Yeah.
And inside the NBA.
They might not cite their sources quite as often, but I guess that's part of the appeal. You're not going to get the stat head breakdowns. You're going to get people off the cuff and busting each other's chops. And Lindsay, you mentioned some concern with the show shifting over to ESPN. The good news is that it's still going to be in the same studio, still produced by TNT, so there would seem to be less cause for concern about ESPN messing it up somehow. Hopefully they're as tolerant of Barkley being Barkley as TNT has been, but, they've been a little less sensitive about their talent saying inflammatory things for better and for worse, so hopefully he can get away with these things because he's kind of one of one, but it really is a testament to the appeal of that show that it survived this whole parting of ways and lawsuits and rights issues and the TNT losing the NBA, though gaining Unrivaled, which we will talk about in our bonus segment. But the idea that this show was just too precious to lose, that everyone had to come together, all these different brands and corporate interests to protect inside the NBA. And, they say it might not be airing weekly on ESPN, so it's not entirely clear if it will be as frequent or the same format, but it has become kind of known as the View for Dudes, essentially. And it's just everyone really loves it. And so I'm glad that it can continue in some way, the Statler and Waldorf of sports.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/campaign to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/campaign. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be. Afterballs
have returned recently on Hang Up and Listen. Lindsay, you've got a setup for Ben. You're going to throw up the alley-oop, which Ben can dunk, and then the crew on Inside the NBA can hoot and holler about at halftime?
Yeah, so we talked about one momentous weekend for women's sports, the NWSL Championship game. And as I was on my flight leaving Kansas City, I was lucky enough to have TV, thanks Delta. And while many of my fellow passengers were watching the awful first halves of Giants Bucks and Commanders Cowboys, I had my eyes on NBC, where 21-year-old Thai player Gino Titikul overcame a 2-shot deficit on the final 2 holes with an eagle birdie finish to defeat Angel Yin in the season-ending CME Group Tour Championship on the LPGA Tour. This won Titikul $4 million, the largest paycheck in women's golf history. Earlier the same week, she had won a $1 million bonus through the year-long Aon Risk Reward Challenge, a competition based on how players score on a designated hole each week, meaning she earned $5 million in 1 week. Only 92 players in LPGA history have even won $5 million in their entire career. The 92nd player on that list, Sun Young-yu, a South Korean golfer who won 1 major in her career, the 2012 Chevron Championship, was known among her fellow South Koreans as the course clown. Ben, who is your course clown?
Well, Major League Baseball hasn't expanded since 1998, which makes this the league's longest expansion drought since the so-called expansion era began in 1961. Last year, MLB Commissioner Rob Manfred said that once the then Oakland A's and the Tampa Bay Rays sorted out their ballpark situations, the league would put together an expansion committee, quote, pretty shortly thereafter. Last week, Manfred was asked where those expansion plans stand, given that the A's and Rays are both slated to play in minor league ballparks next season, with considerable uncertainty surrounding their long-term homes. Manfred responded, "I'm hopeful that we'll be able to work through the situation in Tampa Bay in a way that keeps me on the timetable that I've articulated, which is to have an expansion decision made before I leave in 4 years." So this is a legacy-building matter for him. The 66-year-old Manfred, who is 2 months away from celebrating 10 years in office, announced earlier this year that he intends to retire in January 2029, right around the time that someone will hopefully succeed Donald Trump as commander-in-chief. Unlike U.S. presidents, sports commissioners have no term limits, and they tend to stay in office for a very long time. Manfred is actually the shortest tenured of the current commissioners of the Big Four American men's leagues. The NBA's Adam Silver took the place of the extremely long-serving David Stern about a year before Manfred inherited his job from Bud Selig. The NFL's Roger Goodell replaced Paul Tagliabue in 2006. And as for the NHL's Gary Bettman, Alex, what year were you born?
1994.
Okay.
I only remember one NHL commissioner.
Yes. Well, technically, there's only been one, the once and forever, the God Emperor of the NHL, because he is the first to hold that title. But he took over, Gary Bettman, before you were born on February 1st, 1993. So you have never known a world where Gary Bettman wasn't presiding over the NHL and being booed in public wherever he went.
Well, yeah.
Comes with the territory.
Norms.
Yeah.
Societal norms. When he goes, I won't know how to walk down the street.
So last week on my baseball podcast, Effectively Wild, we were talking about why commissioners last so long, and I idly wondered which have historically lasted longer, commissioners of the Big Four men's sports leagues or Supreme Court justices. Both tend to get their gigs when they're well into their careers, but Supreme Court justices have the advantage of being appointed for life. Then again, commissioners might as well be. The last one who was actually ousted was Bud Selig's predecessor, Fay Vincent, back in 1992. These are both jobs that are hard to get and just as hard to lose. So I have now tackled this crucial justice versus commissioner question. The first thing I had to decide was who counts as a commissioner. Landis, Kennesaw Mountain Landis of MLB was called commissioner, but the heads of the NFL, NBA, and NHL weren't technically called commissioners until 1941, 1967, and 1993, respectively. Prior to those points, the top execs were called presidents. So I broke down the data two ways. The strict constructionalist approach, where I included commissioners only if they held that literal title, and the loose constructionalist approach, where I lumped in those quasi-commissioner presidents too. Even with the more expansive method, I filtered out a few presidents or proto-presidents. I didn't count Ralph Hay, the first head of the NFL, whose title was temporary secretary, like the Paul McCartney song. Nor did I count Jim Thorpe, the semi-figurehead first president of the NFL who continued to play for the Canton Bulldogs during his one season, nominally in office. I also excluded Gil Stein, who was interim NHL president before Bettman became the first and thus far only commissioner. Stein was in office for about a year, during which time he was found to have engineered his own election to the Hockey Hall of Fame, a dubious honor he was forced to decline. Another edge case was Red Dutton, the NHL's acting president after Frank Calder died, who repeatedly tried to resign to tend to his construction company. I included Dutton because he did eventually accept a permanent position as president, though he drags down the average because he quickly got in a fight with the owners, told them you can stick your franchise up your ass, and resigned for good. As for the justices, I started with George Sutherland, who was appointed by President Harding in 1922. So he was the first justice to join the court after the 1917 election of Frank Calder, first president of the NHL, and the 1920 hiring of Kennesaw Mountain Landis, first commissioner of baseball, who was himself a federal judge for 17 years, a shorter time than the 24 years he would serve as commissioner. Starting with Sutherland, there have been 43 justices over this span, compared to 20 commissioners or 27 commissioners plus presidents. The justices' average tenure has been 17.4 years, with a median of 16.3 years. So those are the numbers to beat. Can commissioners beat them? Spoiler, no, not quite. But they do come close. The commissioners have averaged 14 years in office with a median of 12.8 years. The commissioners plus presidents have averaged 14.5 years in office with a median of 14.2. So depending on your metric, the justices have tended to serve only 2 to 3 years longer than the commissioners, with the baseball commissioners having the highest turnover rate, followed by the basketball ones, and then football and hockey. The football presidents and commissioners are protected by the shield. Now, one might object that including justices and commissioners who are still serving skews things somewhat. If you include all active justices, then you're counting Clarence Thomas, who joined the court even before Alex was born and Bettman became commissioner. But you're also counting fairly recent arrivals like Amy Coney Barrett and Ketanji Brown Jackson. If we look only at completed tenures, the average for the justices rises to 18.2 years with a median of 16.7. As for the commissioners, dropping Bettman, Goodell, Silver, and Manfred from the sample lowers the average to 13 years with a median of 12.8, or 14 or 14.2 for the commissioners plus presidents. So if you look at it that way, the longevity advantages for justices is somewhere between 2.5 and 5 years. No commissioner has lasted as long as Justice William O. Douglas, an FDR appointee who served for more than 36 years on the court, and no justice has had as fleeting a term as Bart Giamatti, who died in office after 5 years as MLB commissioner. Fun fact, Paul Giamatti's dad. Still.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
I was literally just going to ask. Unbelievable.
Yes, I have anticipated that question and answered it. Still, however you slice it, becoming commissioner confers almost as much job security as becoming a Supreme Court justice, and maybe that makes sense. Yes, most commissioners are pretty unpopular, but the job comes with considerable cachet, a lot of TV airtime, and a very generous salary, so most people are reluctant to relinquish it. And while it seems unlikely that so many commissioners could have been the best men for their jobs for decades on end, a lot of their duties depend on relationships and institutional memory, so experience is important. Plus, most commissioners are there to provide cover for the owners and to do the owner's bidding, if they aren't owners themselves, as Bud Selig was. And owners prioritize dependability, predictability, and compliance. They don't want someone who's going to upset the apple cart as long as revenue keeps climbing. We'll see if it continues to, what with all the broadcasting questions we considered on last week's show. But on the whole, business has been good, and thus commissioners have tended to keep their jobs for a very long time. So, Alex and Lindsay, there are plenty of people who think Supreme Court justices should have a mandatory retirement age or a term limit. Do you think commissioners also serve too long, and should leagues be more willing to limit their terms?
Yeah, let's elect them by popular vote, but not of the owners, of the society.
Yeah, that would guarantee that they'd be pretty unpopular with the owners, I think.
Yeah. I would agree.
My answer is yes, and Ben, that was phenomenal.
Thank you.
You know, Ben, my ears perk up when I hear Kennesaw Mountain Landis, because Kennesaw Mountain Landis becoming commissioner of baseball is sort of like if a very laissez-faire EPA regulator then gets a job like running, I don't know, British Petroleum.
Yeah.
Kennesaw Mountain Landis, as a federal judge, heard a challenge in the 1910s to baseball's reserve clause.
Yes.
In a case that threatened to really blow up the business of baseball. And many would say, including me, that he slow-walked it and allowed a settlement to take place where he did not rule against Major League Baseball and facilitated decades of an antitrust exemption for Major League Baseball. Some would say that he was then handsomely rewarded for that when he became the commissioner of baseball and oversaw the league's response to the Black Sox scandal, I believe.
Yes, and that was why he was hired, to restore faith in the integrity of the game. He did do that job. Another thing he slow-walked, however, was the integration of the game. And it is not a coincidence that Jackie Robinson broke into the National League after Kennesaw kicked it.
Well, that's Kennesaw Mountain Landis, not to be confused with Kennesaw State University, which is looking for a head football coach right now after firing their last coach. That is all for this episode. We've also got a bonus episode that is live right now about Unrivaled, a new women's basketball league that has really, I think, changed a significant bit of the off-season landscape for the WNBA, and Lindsay is going to tell us how significant this is for the future of women's basketball as a whole. To hear that show, you can subscribe to Slate Plus on Apple Podcasts by clicking Try Free at the top of our show page, or visit slate.com/hangup+ to get access wherever you listen. The episode is available right now, and we will see you over there. Our show notes are at slate.com/hangup, and you can email us at hangup@slate.com. Don't forget to follow the show and rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Our producer is Kevin Bendis. For Ben Lindbergh and Lindsay Gibbs, I'm Alex Kirshner. Remember Zelma Beatty, and thank you for listening.